Hannah Murray on TRE in the afternoon.
And joining us on the line now is Karen Bloom Gevirtz, who spent nearly 3 decades as a professor of English at American universities. Her book, The Apothecary's Wife, is the hidden history of medicine and how it became a commodity. It challenges the myths of the triumph of science and instead uncovers the fascinating truth. Welcome to the show, Karen.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you. Thank you for joining us. So this is a fascinating one. Where did you come up with this subject to write a book about it?
Well, it happened actually as an accident. I went to England to research a very different subject, the role of the scientific revolution in ordinary women's lives. And I had this wonderful fellowship to study at Chawton House Library, which is a library in the manor house owned by Jane Austen's brother. And I was in the basement on the very first day, and the archivist said, "I'm sure you'd like to look at this book, The Curious Herbal." And I said, "Sure," because you never say no to an archivist. And I flipped open the book and I looked at it, and lo and behold, I discovered everything that I had thought for the previous 2 years was completely wrong. And so for the next month, I started reorganizing my thoughts, and I discovered that, in fact, women had not quietly accepted the scientific revolution, that there had been a lot of resistance, and that there had been a lot of economic competition. And so everything changed around, and I discovered instead that people who made money from drugs were the minority, and women who gave drugs for free at home because that was part of their jobs were the majority. And something really big happened to make us go from getting medication at home from trusted people for free without having to get our feet wet to paying for medication from strangers and having to go outside to go get it. And all of that because of one moment in a 500-year-old basement when I said, yes.
Yes, that's incredible. I'm fascinated to learn more about this, because you talk a lot about the history of all of this, and the fact that the running joke in Europe for centuries was that anyone in a hurry to die should call the doctor.
Yes. Another one was the young physician fattens the churchyard. That was another one. So for hundreds of years, the professional physician, the person who was trained in a university and therefore male, was somebody who worked for the elite, for royal families, for very, very wealthy aristocrats. And the vast majority of people did not have access to those people. There were very, very few of them. Most people didn't have money to pay them, so professionals didn't want to work for people who couldn't pay, not surprisingly. So where did medication come from? Medication came from the woman in your life. And unlike the professionals who learned medication and medicine from books and from theories about the body, women learned it from trial and error. So if you had a medicine that really worked really well for heart palpitations or jaundice or headaches, you kept using that. And if it didn't work, you said, well, I'm not using this anymore. And you would stop using it and go get a better recipe, something that did work better. But physicians, because they were following what they thought were rules set out by authorities like Galen and Hippocrates and Aristotle, they didn't give up when a medication didn't work. They thought, well, it must have been something else. And so their cures did not work nearly as well. Also, they used a lot of physical interventions like bloodletting and cupping and leeches and that sort of thing. And women just didn't use that sort of thing. So the actual debilitation that you'd get from a physician's treatment didn't happen at home. So treatments were much more successful at home than they were by professionals for hundreds of years.
Wow, so isn't that amazing? So what changed then? How did the two things switch?
Well, they switched in perception before they actually switched in effectiveness. So now, in the 21st century, there's no way that I would recommend treating jaundice or bacterial infection or heart palpitations at home, right? I mean, I'm also not a physician, so you should never take my medical advice anyway. But modern medicine, modern science works far, far better, right? But at the time, at the 17th century and into the 18th century, actually until really the early 19th century, professionals' medication and women's medication were made from the same stuff. They were made from plants. They were made from organic materials. Once spices became cheaper, they were made from spices. So it was really the same. So what made the change happen was really a public relations campaign. Professionals used the ideas of the scientific revolution to say their medications were far superior to women's. They disguised ingredients by calling them by their Latin names. They wrote them down in a special code so that ordinary people couldn't read them. And they put a real sense of effectiveness and mystique on their work at the same time that they denigrated women's medication, and they caused a huge perception shift. So physicians and apothecaries who were making medication from the same ingredients and using the same processes, they were just diluting the ingredients an enormous amount by processing them over and over and over again, really persuaded people to go out and get the better stuff. Just like people say, you absolutely must have this terribly expensive coat or a pair of shoes. And maybe they're not really any better than the regular coat or pair of shoes, but people go, oh, yes, I must have that one. And it was essentially that. Eventually, of course, science did start producing better medication by using chemistry and understanding physiology better, but that took a while.
Yeah. I mean, I guess when it eventually did happen, it sort of laid the foundations for big pharma and that all kicking in.
Absolutely. The creation of medication as something that you paid for really laid the foundations for big pharma. It created an economy, and it created a norm for paying for medication. And so once you had the norm and once you had an economy, all you needed now was the business to fill in. So they created systems of regulation to make sure that people who made up medications or women couldn't get into the market. They reinforced the prescription system. So the only way to get medication was to get a prescription from a physician and then to take that prescription to an apothecary or what we would call a pharmacist or a chemist today. So there were all sorts of ways of creating a very narrow way of getting medication, and it had to be from the professional producers. So the birth of big pharma really came about, amazingly enough, between about 1650 and 1740.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I get that there has to be rules in place and regulations when it comes to medicine and who can get hold of medicine and things like that. Obviously, there needs to be things in place. But I do struggle with the whole correlation between health and money and who makes money out of people being ill, which is a very fascinating subject to look into.
And troubling. I mean, when you think about it, the system that we've got now, right, for-profit medication, has a basic set of values at its core that are kind of startling, right? One of them is it's better that a corporation be healthy than a human being be healthy. Another is it's more important that somebody make a profit than that somebody get better or live. Even. So it's all right that people can't pay for medication and therefore die because we have a set of values that allows that to happen. We're okay with that. We've created a system that promotes that practice and that is built on that set of values. So big pharma is just doing what the system was set up to do. That doesn't make it good and okay, but that's the system that was set up. So what we lost when we lost women's domestic medication was we lost the idea that health is a community concern, that nobody should suffer alone, nobody does suffer alone, that the health of one individual is the health of everybody, it's the health of their children, it's the health of their servants or tenants, it's the health of the town that depends on them, or the community that depends on them. We also lost this idea that medication should be shared, that if you have a good cure, it's not your property. It should be belonging to everyone. And so women shared recipes very freely under the idea that, of course you do. Like, you don't keep that to yourself. If you've got a great recipe for an eye medicine, or you have a way of easing menstrual cramps, or a way of healing burns, and there are a lot of burns, for people who worked in kitchens especially, but also, say, gunpowder burns and that sort of thing, you didn't keep it to yourself. You shared it. And so we have a whole set of values that have really been pushed to the side in order to create this economy of medication. They're not gone by any means. You can still see them very much, those old values, at work in lots of places, say government regulation for food to make sure that it's healthy, for example. My favorite example of this is iodized salt, which is a public health issue. Human beings need iodine, but a lot of people do not live where you can get it naturally. Iodine basically occurs in shellfish and seaweed. And there's a lot of people who don't live near places where you can get shellfish and seaweed. But if you iodize salt, everybody can get enough iodine. And so in the countries where the government makes sure that salt is iodized and requires salt to be iodized, iodine deficiency is at minute levels. And that's a great relationship between public health, private enterprise, because corporations can still produce salt. They can still make money from iodized salt or iodized bread, or you can iodize all sorts of things. So that system works. The idea that everybody benefits when everybody can have their health protected and restored. So those values aren't gone. They're just not part of the for-profit medication system.
Yeah.
So they tend to be pushed aside.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, when you look back on how it was done before and the women in people's life doing it, it was always going to be coming from a place of love and care and protection.
Exactly.
Compared to coming from a place of making money. I mean, I'm not saying that that's the case with every single physician that you go to, obviously. No. And as you say, we've learned a lot more scientifically now, which is obviously a huge improvement in terms of the amount of medication that's now available, which is obviously a really positive thing. But unless you have a physician that you know, that you can trust, that maybe's been with the family for many years, when you're going to see someone that's giving you medication, you don't really know whether they're coming from a place of care and research and knowledge and giving you the best thing that's right for you, which is why it's so important for people to do their own research, I think, you know, looking into the medication that you've been given. It's happened to members of my family multiple times when they've been given medication for something and then they've come away and researched and realized that if they took that medication along with other medication they were originally taking, it could be fatal. But so many people will take medication without looking into it, assuming and knowing that the person giving it to them has the knowledge and is, you know, giving you the perfect thing.
There has to be a relationship, I think, between any patient and any caregiver, whoever they are, right? That patients need to advocate for themselves. Nobody knows themselves better. Right. You know your symptoms. You also know what medications you're taking. You know your allergies. And so you really need to ask questions and advocate and be informed. This is one of the things that drives me crazy about insufficient science education, that people have no idea how their own bodies work. And so they don't know to say, well, that makes me really itchy. Should I worry about that? And the same thing for the way women are always, the protocols for, say, heart attack should be very different for women. In a lot of places, people don't even know. Women are very often told that they're being hysterical when, in fact, there's something quite wrong with them. And so there's also a need for patients to speak up, but also we really need to think about how we're training professionals. And that's been a big issue in the United States. I'm ashamed to say that I don't know about medical training in other countries nearly as well. But in the United States, there's been a real push to teach physicians and nurses, pharmacists and so on to listen and to give time and to ask questions. I used to teach a course in illness and literature to train professional caregivers how to listen and pay attention to the words that people used so that they could give better care. The system doesn't reward that. Unfortunately, the system rewards moving through as quickly as possible to see as many patients in an hour as you possibly can. But one of the things we know is that physicians, in particular, physicians who slow down, take the time, listen, ask questions, allow patients to ask questions, their health outcomes for their patients notably higher. Their mortality rates are much slower. Their success rates in treating illness much higher. And very interestingly, in the United States, it tends to be women physicians who do that. So women physicians, say in teaching hospitals, statistics, a study a couple years ago showed that their sort of the outcomes of their treatment tended to be higher than male physicians in the same environments, because they spent more time with patients, because they listened differently. That's not to generalize. That's not to say all women physicians are better than all male physicians or anything like that. But just to say that practices that tend to be performed by women physicians are associated with better health outcomes. So communication really needs to be so important. Knowledge, communication, trust by all means, but that trust needs to be underpinned by communication and listening.
Definitely.
That used to be the case with domestic medication, right? Like your mother used to know when you weren't feeling well, sometimes before you did. Just like today, a parent can say, small child is not feeling well. They're not as lively as they used to be, or something like that. So we need that sort of thing.
Yeah, asking questions should be really obvious, but so many people don't. So many people don't. I've spoken to many friends and family members over the years who, go to the doctor with all kinds of problems, explain their symptoms. The doctor gives them medication. They say, "Thank you, doctor," and off they go and start taking the medication without saying, "So what's in this? And I'm already taking this medication. Will this be okay with that? Or are there any side effects of this medication?" So many questions you should ask. So you know what you're putting into your body and you're happy to go ahead before you start doing it.
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to be adversarial. It can be a partnership between you and the caregiver. It doesn't have to be, well, I don't think you know the best thing. It can simply be, well, I need to be informed. I'm entitled to information. Yeah. That's one of the problems of that transition that I talked about, the commodification of medication, is that to promote professionals' medicine, one of the things they did was they said, well, this is science, and science is special, and they used all sorts of fancy words and lots of Latin, and they said ordinary people can't understand that. And I think we very much live with that legacy, the idea that there's something separate or intimidating or difficult about science because it's got fancy words, or you need to study it in special ways, and all sorts of cultural associations with it. And in fact, that's not at all the case. In college, I was an English major and I worked in a neurochemistry lab. You don't have to be a special, talented, whatever. Anybody can understand it. It just has that patina, I guess, a reputation of being intimidating. And so people don't challenge when there's no reason why they should.
Oh, definitely.
Kind of way.
It really annoys me when people say you can't argue with science. Well, yes, you can. Science science has been wrong over the years, and science has changed, and science has evolved, and what people thought was true sometimes now isn't true. Things have changed in so many different areas of science. There are some things that you can't argue with that is always the same, but many things to do with medication, as a prime example, has evolved over the years as we've learned different things through history. So that's a really silly, arrogant thing to say, I think.
Well, and if you know about science, also that the idea of challenging is built into it, right? So you have to have replicable results. You can't do an experiment once and say, okay, well, we've solved the problem. Somebody else needs to be able to replicate it. And you need people to verify that you have indeed found your results. And if something comes along and the results challenge the theory, you have to admit that there's a challenge and figure out what's going on and be open to change. The more information you have, the less an earlier explanation may fit. You have to be open to that. And that is built into science when it's done properly. But again, people don't. That's an aspect of science that isn't necessarily well understood. And so people think, well, the pronouncement of a scientist, that's it. And in fact, that's it given what we have. But when we have more, that may not be it.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, it's a fascinating subject. It's been lovely chatting with you, Karen. Thank you for joining us. If listeners want to get a copy of your book, it's called The Apothecary's Wife, The Hidden History of Medicine and How It Became a Commodity. It's available on our website, tre.radio. It's by Karen Bloom Gevirtz, who we've been chatting with today. Karen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.